is what I mean in terms of like perceived headroom, where you're trying to like be able to properly meter where you're at and how this, understanding what you're going to send out to someone, assuming that obviously the mix part of the process, you're sending something out to mastering, right? So that there's enough room for them to work, but also enough room for you to be like, for you to really understand what's happening in a reasonable level, and you're not getting inundated with, sorting through a lot of volume. So anyway, for me, that's kind of why I like to do it, so that I can keep things, from overloading my DAW if it's a very robust session. Also giving yourself headroom, but also if there's a consistency with that, and I know, hey, every time I go in, my snare, the hottest points of my snare on a track are going to clip at -10, you know what I mean? Or are going to peak at -10 after playing through the whole thing. Then if I have a predetermined routing that sits my snare that I can copy, almost in like a hybrid template kind of approach, then I can pull my snare track down into there and know that hypothetically that should be hitting pretty close to where I want it if there's things triggered or like the chain that's already kind of built in or that I like to start with. It should hit my gain staging stuff where I want it. So that's on me because that's part of my mix process, right? So that's to say I always kind of start from scratch. And I think the only time that it would maybe make sense for someone to send stems or their multi-tracks to an engineer that have a lot of that processing and like have that baked in is if it's a really complex or interesting arrangement and they have a very specific vision for what role each thing is playing. But again, a lot of that would be captured and translated in the equivalent of like the raw, like the rough working mix, like the tracking mix, right? Which they should send. So, but
and like I work with like this one hip hop client that like pretty much I won't touch a lot of the levels that he gives me for his stems. I'll just kind of like massage them into place because like how he like what he's doing is like very singular to his like vision. So I'm not trying to like mess with that too much.
Right.
So like and that's also like again knowing the artist, knowing you as like yourself as the artist. How much handicap that do you want to give the engineer, or what's the relationship?
Exactly.
Have you worked with this person before? Do you know that their process is going to turn out great and you just send them what you keep sending them, right. Or is this someone new?
Right.
So
and that's a great place to kind of leave it because as far as that goes, I think if it's just a random mix engineer, you've hired them, you like their work, you love how stuff comes out, and you're willing to extend, as much trust and as much time as they're willing to give their vision because you trust them, then generally speaking, it doesn't have to be that. Just make sure none of your tracks are clipping. Make sure there's no weird edit points in there or like, messed up fades that are going to make that are, that they can't get rid of unless they literally chop them out. And that everything that you have, the other last thing before we kind of move on, is making sure, I see this a lot too, making sure that you kind of strip silence tracks that aren't doing that little extra bit of house cleaning will also be much appreciated on a mix engineer end. You see this a lot with vocals, especially in a home studio. Someone will be tracking vocals, right? And they'll be like, cool, I'm going to do this chorus. And then I'll just let it play through. And then I'll do the next chorus. And it takes whatever, but then maybe sometimes they never go back and chop that out. And in like just playing the whole track back, they don't hear that. But then if a mix engineer is putting it through a very robust chain of saturation, compression, EQ, that's one more thing where then you're asking that mix engineer, and I've had to do this recently, you got to go back in and cut out all of that ambient noise that effectively just sounds like this. And then you'll drive yourself crazy. You'll be like, what the fuck is that? Everything's muted. Oh, it's on the vocal track, and it's this little like they knock the mic for a second, but otherwise you don't see anything. So you assume it was scrubbed and stripped, but it really wasn't. So that's good practice too, so that no little random things sneak in there and drive a mix engineer crazy trying to go like find it, for a second. So that helps.
The last thing I want to say on the strip silence thing is making sure that when you're doing the strip silence, your breaths are very important to the vocal. So determine what vocals need the appropriate breaths and not, and clip game them as such. So like, just don't go and like, I remove every breath.
Right. Yeah. No. Breath. Yeah. Don't overdo it. I'm talking specifically about like after a section, and then there's like the vocal doesn't come in for another like 4, 8, 16 measures or something, but that track was still rolling. So like, that's what I mean. Yeah. And honestly, if you're unsure of it, then just don't touch any like things like right in between phrases or like in between verses. I'm more talking about long extended sections where nothing else is happening and it's just adding to the noise floor unnecessarily unless the track's muted. So that's a great point, Tom, too, because and I almost start to look at this as a creative mix decision. I was talking with a client actually right before this where, I was very specific about, hey, when you go track this, that gap, make sure you don't edit the breath out and like give me a real good breath, to the point where I'm doing this remotely. So somebody else is going to be doing the vocal tracking at another studio. I'll be like piped in here and there, but for them, I wanted to make sure I was like, hey, the breath, it's about this breath. It's about the pause and I need that. Make sure that's in there. Make sure that they don't scrub it, or make sure that you don't need in that and like back away from the mic, because I'll want to make sure that I can put that in like a really cool, energy moment in the track. So when in doubt, just leave them in. And normally like, unless you know exactly how you want them to translate, but usually that's an okay thing where I would be like, I wouldn't be upset if those were left in between like phrases and stuff, and I had to like clip gain that down. Or Tom, I know you and I do this a ton with like S's and plosives and stuff. Like, it doesn't bother you in the raw track, but then you like really amp it up and you're like, cool, the de-esser's just not doing it. I gotta clip gain that S on the end of that phrase down just a touch, so it doesn't, completely ignite, my eardrums, in that top range. So yeah, that's a great point as far as the strip silence goes. But generally speaking, that's just like, I call it house cleaning, in sense of like making sure your your fades are good, they're clean, there's no clipping. If there is a clipping, find another take that doesn't have clipping. And then just if there's like bits where it's like, cool, you stopped recording the guitar, nothing else happens on that track, but there's still like, 10 seconds of amp noise at the end of it, right? Yeah. Like, clean up that kind of stuff so that they don't have to do that stuff. Because that's all stuff that takes away from the next creative phase of that mixing. But yeah, I mean, so moving into that, I want to talk a little bit about what we were starting to touch on before, and just kind of understanding the intent, and maybe also too, as far as like how this applies across different instruments. We obviously talked about drums a little bit already, but I think it's really important to re-emphasize when it comes to editing, for feel, where the line is kind of drawn for that. And sometimes it's based on genre, but I want to kind of go around the horn, and because everybody has their own little thing. I have my own little, way that I've, learned to kind of trust my instinct and gut on something, instead of always like editing with your eyes, which I think, we talk about listening with our eyes a lot. And that's a classic studio thing that, sometimes you'll see a musician is just watching the screen more than like thinking about the song, and you got to kind of curtail that. But Tom, what's your general like thought? If you're like, hey, I'm editing something and it's not something that you're like heavily gridding, or not a percussive thing that you're trying to really ratchet down to a grid, but something that you're trying to make sure you don't mess up really good feel and just enhance the feel of whatever instrument or vocalist is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way is like, can you play it? Does it feel good? Like if like I'll air drum to it and look really dumb. Pre-COVID, it was me air drumming in coffee shops, which it sounds like a pop punk song, writing to like just waiting to happen.
Oh yeah.
But now it's at my stand-up desk. So as far as that goes, like if it feels good, then don't touch it. Like is kind of where I would land.
Yeah. And I mean, and likewise, I think I've learned the hard way too sometimes. If you start going in and looking how things line up with the grid, you'll start giving yourself more work because you'll be like, oh, cool, that one thing's like a little bit behind or a little bit ahead. And so you'll go and you'll chop that out and like move it. And then you'll play that whole section back and be like, well, crap, now the snare after it feels like it's too early. Well, let me move that back a little bit. And then before you know it, you're like, oh, right. If I just left it in, the drummer and the whole band kind of push ahead in that section. But now the drums are on and the whole band's off. So now my options are either edit every instrument in that section ahead and nudge it a little bit, or just go undo what I just spent the last 10 minutes doing. So that's why I say like less work. If you can just hear it through and you don't at any point feel like, oh, that was a little late, or that feels like it's rushing, then it's probably in a pretty good place, especially considering if that's what the rest of the band tracked drums to it, or if your vocalist sang to the drums that were there, you know, and it all feels good together, then see how far you can get. And I always do what, like I said, kind of like trying to not edit with my eyes. I do the eyes closed thing, right? So sometimes even if you're not looking at the actual DAW, I will at the end when I'm done editing a stuff, like Adam, like I knew I did a lot of stuff with the Honey Jar record and then stuff that, you know, we've worked on since out of the studio. And I will always, whenever I'm in editing mode, just to make sure I have not overdone it or to make sure it is better than before, I always have the existing unedited playlist underneath, and I will always do a side-by-side. I will listen to the unedited, whether it's drum tracks or like full band edits with guitars, bass, vocals. I will always listen to the unedited tracks and reference them against my edit and make sure that unequivocally I'm like, yep, I headbang harder, I nod harder, and when I close my eyes and listen to both of them, the edit has me more engaged and more gripped, right? And the second I hear a moment where I'm like, oh, I was curious, was that weird? Was that whatever? If I think about it more than once, I go look at it. And that's the thing for me. If I'm not thinking about it or it's not something that I like, oh, weird. Wait, did that snare hit? Did that fill feel weird? You know, then I'll go look at it. But otherwise, if I can listen down to the whole song with like a decent, like rough balance too, this is also kind of important, then I'll know that we're cooking. We're where we need to be, you know. And then there are some times where, you know, later on down the stage, like in a mix thing, I'll catch like one last little thing and I'll be like, well, that's so easy. That's literally just shifting that whole track, that one like shaker effect or whatever back a little bit. But usually it's really easy, and which is kind of the last way. Tom, I know we do this, and I do this a lot. I mean, this is pretty much the way because that Honey Jar record, Adam, was so there, and like the musicianship on it was killer. This is pretty much the way I treated it. And Tom, even the record you're doing now, you know, with like Charlie's drums, it's like you got to know when you have a really good player that has a really inherent feel, and don't chop that up and just completely annihilate it. But if it's a thing where, hey, they were a little bit on top of the beat, but I just want it to slink back a touch, then just take that whole section and bump it like a couple milliseconds. You know, sometimes I'll do that, like where I call it like kind of just pocketing, right? Where it's not taking one specific like instrument, or, you know, and just saying, hey, this is good, but the bass player, and sometimes it's an artifact of they recorded to a different take or all recorded together, and then you switched a different drum comp for that section for whatever reason because it felt stronger. So now you just have to kind of nudge a whole section just a touch if like the band was playing together. But I just call that, I look at it as like pocketing rather than just like trying to line everything up in a computer sense. Anything to say on that?